The morning he told me to get out, I was still in my pajamas. I remember that detail clearly. The pale blue cotton set my mother had sent me for my birthday, the one with tiny white stars on the hem. I had been standing in the kitchen making coffee, the kind of ordinary Tuesday morning I had lived 1,000 times in that house. And my husband walked in, set his phone face down on the counter and said, without looking at me, that he wanted a divorce, and that I had until the end of the week to be out. I did not cry. I think I was too confused to cry. His name was Donovan. We had been married for 6 years. I was 31 years old, and I had spent the last 4 of those years building his freight logistics company from a spreadsheet and a dream he had sketched on a napkin into something real. A company with 12 employees, a warehouse lease in Indianapolis, and contracts with 3 mid-size manufacturers in the Midwest. I had done the books. I had written the proposals. I had sat across from bankers and talked them into believing in us when Donovan could not make the numbers make sense on his own. I had given up a position at a regional accounting firm to do it. My supervisor at the time had told me I was making a mistake. I had smiled and said I believed in my husband. That Tuesday morning in the kitchen, I stood there holding my coffee mug and watched Donovan walk back upstairs without another word, and I thought, I built this. I built all of this. And now he is telling me it is over before the coffee is even ready. I found out about Tessa 3 days later, the way you always find out, through a detail that did not quite fit. A receipt from a restaurant I had never been to. A message preview on his phone before he could turn the screen away. I did not confront him immediately. I sat with it for a full day, which was the hardest thing I have ever done, because every instinct in my body was screaming. But I had learned, from years of working with numbers and contracts, that you do not react until you understand exactly what you are looking at. Tessa, I would later learn, had been hired as a sales consultant for the company 8 months earlier. She was 26. She had a social media presence that my husband had apparently been admiring for longer than 8 months. The week after he asked me to leave, Donovan had a lawyer send me a separation agreement. It was 12 pages long and it arrived via email with no phone call, no conversation, just a message from his attorney that said my husband was prepared to be generous and hoped we could resolve this quickly. I read it twice. The agreement offered me a single cash settlement, $40,000, and a waiver of any claim to the business, the house, or the retirement accounts. It described my role in the company as informal administrative support. 6 years of building that company, and they had reduced it to those 3 words. At the bottom of the last page, there was a line for my signature. I set my laptop aside and called my older sister Brenda, who lives in Columbus and who has always been the person I call when I need someone to tell me the truth without softening it. "Do not sign anything," she said, before I had even finished explaining. "I know. Do you have a lawyer?" I told her I did not, and that based on the settlement offer, I was not sure I could afford one quickly enough. The agreement had a response deadline of 15 business days. Brenda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did their books for 4 years. You know where everything is." She was right. I did. I spent the next 10 days doing something that probably looked from the outside like falling apart. I did not leave the apartment I had temporarily rented. I did not answer social calls. I barely slept. But I was not falling apart. I was working. I pulled every document I had retained from my time managing the company's finances, and because I am an accountant by training and by temperament, I had retained a great deal. Contracts, bank statements, tax filings, payroll records, emails where Donovan had explicitly asked me to restructure invoicing systems, negotiate vendor terms, prepare financial projections for their lending agreements. There was also something else. About 2 years into my time with the company, I had noticed a pattern in the accounts receivable that did not make sense to me. Payments coming in from a vendor we had no corresponding purchase records for. Small amounts at first. $2,000 here. $3,500 there. Then larger. I had flagged it to Donovan at the time, and he had told me it was a consulting retainer, an arrangement he had set up before I started managing the books, and that it was handled. I had made a note of it and moved on because I trusted him, and because there was always something else demanding my attention. I was not moving on anymore. I went back through 3 years of those records. The payments added up to a number that made my hands go still on the keyboard when I calculated it. Just over $280,000, flowing through the business from a vendor whose registered address, when I searched the state business registry, turned on to be a mailbox at a UPS store in Carmel, Indiana. I printed everything. I organized it into a binder, and then I called a lawyer, not to hire her, because I still could not afford her retainer, but because she offered a free 30-minute consultation, and 30 minutes was all I needed to understand my options. Her name was Patricia Webb, and within 10 minutes of looking at what I had brought, she was no longer watching the clock. She told me 2 things. The first was that my contribution to the business almost certainly qualified me for an equitable distribution claim, far beyond $40,000 under Indiana law. The second was that the payment pattern I had documented had a name, and that name was not consulting retainer. I could not afford Patricia's retainer. I told her that honestly. She looked at the binder in her hands and then looked at me. Had you considered representing yourself for the initial filing? I can help you understand the process. You clearly understand the documentation. That is how I ended up in a courtroom in Marion County 6 weeks later, standing at the respondent's table alone, while Donovan sat across from me next to his attorney, a senior partner at a firm downtown whose hourly rate I happened to know because I had once processed an invoice for a consultation Donovan had with him 2 years earlier. Donovan's attorney's name was Mr. Aldridge. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, and he had the particular kind of calm that comes from spending decades in rooms where the outcome was rarely in doubt. When he saw me standing alone at my table, he leaned over and said something quietly to Donovan, and Donovan smiled. It was a small smile, the practiced kind. But I had been watching that man's face for 6 years, and I knew exactly what it meant. He thought this was already over. The judge entered and the room stood, and I smoothed the front of my blazer and stood with everyone else. I had bought the blazer the week before from a consignment shop on Mass Ave. It was charcoal gray with a slight structure to the shoulder. And when I had tried it on in the dressing room, I had stood there for a long moment looking at my own reflection, trying to decide if I looked like someone who belonged in a courtroom. I decided I looked like someone who had done the work. The initial hearing was procedural, both parties presenting documentation, the judge establishing the scope of assets in dispute. Mr. Aldridge moved through his presentation with the smooth efficiency of someone billing by the hour. He characterized the business as Donovan's sole creative and entrepreneurial vision. He described my role using the exact language from the settlement agreement. Informal administrative support. He said it without hesitation, without any apparent awareness of how it might sound. When it was my turn, I stood up, and I introduced myself. I told the court my name, that I had a degree in accounting from Purdue University, that I'd spent 4 years as the de facto chief financial officer of my husband's company, without that title or compensation, and that I had documentation to support everything I was about to say. Mr. Aldridge objected twice in the first 4 minutes. Both times the judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Harmon, who had a reputation in the county for having very little patience for procedural gamesmanship, sustained me and overruled him. I presented my employment history prior to the marriage. I presented the emails where Donovan had asked me by name to handle financial negotiations on behalf of the company. I presented the loan applications where my financial analysis had been submitted as the supporting documentation. I presented 3 years of payroll records showing that I had never drawn a salary from a company I had helped build from nothing. Then I presented the binder. I had organized it into 2 sections. The first was my contribution documentation. The second was what I had come to think of as the vendor file. When I handed copies across to Mr. Aldridge and to the clerk, I watched Donovan's face change. It was not the dramatic shift you see in movies. No sudden pallor, no visible panic. It was something smaller and more specific, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, the look of a man recalculating. Judge Harmon reviewed the vendor file in silence for longer than she had reviewed anything else I had submitted. The courtroom was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when something has shifted and no one is quite sure what to do next. "Ms." She looked up at me. "You compiled this yourself?" "Yes, Your Honor. From records I retained during my time managing the company's accounts." She looked back down at the binder. Then she looked at Mr. Aldridge. "Counselor, I'd like your client to explain the nature of this vendor relationship." Mr. Aldridge asked for a recess. Judge Harmon gave him 15 minutes. I sat at my table and drank water from the plastic cup the clerk had given me, and I did not look at Donovan. I had made a decision at some point in the past 6 weeks that I was not going to perform any of this for him. Not the anger, not the fear, not the satisfaction. Whatever I felt was mine to keep. When we reconvened, Mr. Aldridge asked for a continuance to allow his client time to gather additional documentation on the vendor account. Judge Harmon denied the request, she said with the particular economy of language that I had come to associate with her in just a few hours, that the documentation before her raised questions that she was referring to the Indiana Secretary of State's office and to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. Donovan's chair scraped back slightly. It was barely perceptible. But I heard it. The hearing concluded 20 minutes later. Judge Harmon issued a temporary injunction freezing all company assets pending the outcome of the referral. She also noted, for the record, that the original settlement agreement's characterization of my role appeared to be, in her words, materially inconsistent with the documentary evidence presented. I walked out of the courthouse at 20 minutes past noon on a Wednesday in October. The sky was that specific shade of pale blue that only happens in the Midwest in autumn, the kind that looks almost too clean to be real. Brenda was waiting on the steps because she had driven down from Columbus the night before and insisted on being there even though I had told her the hearing would probably be boring and procedural. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened in there?" I told her. She sat down on the courthouse steps in her good coat and put her face in her hands, and I realized she was not crying, she was laughing. The silent, full-body kind that takes over when something is too large for ordinary laughter. $280,000, she said. At minimum. From a UPS store. In Carmel. She looked up at me. "He thought you were going to sign that paper." "He did." $40,000. She shook her head. "For 4 years. I sat down next to her on the steps. The city moved around us, people coming and going through the courthouse doors, a delivery truck idling at the curb, a group of law students in lanyards walking past in a cluster. Normal life, happening at normal speed. While mine had been moving at something else entirely for the past 6 weeks. "Are you okay?" Brenda asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered, the way I always do with her. "I think I will be," I said. "I think I already mostly am." The federal referral moved faster than I expected. Within 3 weeks of the hearing, I'd been contacted by an investigator from the U.S. Attorney's Office who asked if I would be willing to provide my documentation and answer some questions. I said yes. I spent 4 hours in a conference room going through every record I had, explaining every anomaly, walking them through the 3-year pattern I had traced through the accounts. The investigator across the table, a woman about my age, compact and careful with her words, took notes in a small notebook and occasionally asked me to slow down. At one point she looked up from her notes and said, "You put this together yourself?" I did. Before you had a lawyer. Before I could afford one. She wrote something down. I could not see what. The divorce settlement took another 4 months to finalize. Indiana is an equitable distribution state, which means the court divides marital assets based on what is fair, not necessarily 50-50, and the evidence of my contributions to the business carried significant weight. My final settlement included a share of the company's appraised value, a portion of the retirement accounts, and a cash payment that was not $40,000. It was also agreed as part of the settlement that I would retain all documentation I had compiled and that my cooperation with the federal investigation would continue independent of the divorce proceedings. I do not know exactly what happened to Donovan after that, because the federal process moves slowly and the details are not mine to share. What I know is that the company is no longer operating under his control. What I know is that the vendor at the UPS store in Carmel turned out to be registered to a name that Donovan had used to funnel money out of the business, for reasons that are now a matter of federal record. What I know is that he thought I would sign that paper. He thought informal administrative support would be enough to make me feel like that was all I had ever been. I think about that a lot. not with bitterness, which surprised me, but with something closer to clarity. 6 years of my life went into something I believed in. Some of that was wasted, yes. Some of it was betrayal. But some of it, the skills I built, the instincts I sharpened, the ability to sit down in front of a stack of financial records and find the thing that does not belong, that part was mine. It was always mine. He just did not know what he was standing next to. Brenda called me a few months after the settlement closed. She had just gotten off the phone with our mother, who had apparently heard through some family relay that things had worked out for me, and wanted to know if I was seeing anyone. "Tell her I'm busy," I said. "Doing what?" I was sitting at my new desk, in my new apartment, reviewing the financials for a small manufacturing client, my first client since I had quietly reopened my accounting practice. The afternoon light came through the window at an angle that made everything look a little warmer than it probably was. "Working," I said. Brenda laughed. "She's not going to like that answer. She never does." Outside, Indianapolis was doing what it does in February: gray sky, thin light, the particular quiet of a city that is waiting for spring. I looked at the numbers on my screen. They were honest numbers, the kind that meant what they said. I had always liked that about accounting. The numbers do not perform. They simply are. I thought about the pale blue pajamas, the Tuesday morning, the coffee I never finished. Then I pulled up the next file and got back to work. People ask me sometimes what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the courtroom, or the moment I read that settlement agreement, or the Tuesday morning in the kitchen when Donovan told me it was over without even finishing his coffee first. But the hardest part was actually the 10 days in between, the days when I could have signed, when the deadline was sitting there and the number looked real enough, and the path of least resistance was right in front of me. $40,000. 12 pages. One line at the bottom: I did not sign because of anything dramatic. I did not have a revelation. I just sat down at my kitchen table with a stack of documents I had spent 4 years creating, and I started reading. That is all. That is the whole story of how things changed. I read what I had already written. I think about Donovan a lot, but not the way I expected to. I do not think about him with anger, which surprised me when I first noticed it. What I think about is the specific miscalculation he made, and how long it must have been building without him realizing it. He looked at me every day for 6 years and saw someone managing his paperwork. He never once looked at the paperwork itself. He never considered that the person who knows where every number lives also knows when a number does not belong. He handed me a document designed to erase 4 years of my work, and assumed I would not know what I was looking at. That is not a failure of cruelty exactly. It is a failure of attention, and I have come to believe that most of the damage people do to each other comes from exactly that, not from being monstrous, but from never paying close enough attention to what is actually in front of them. What I did in those 10 days was not brave. I want to be clear about that because the word gets used too easily. It was not courage that kept me from signing. It was competence. It was 4 years of learning to read a set of accounts until the story they told became as clear to me as plain English. The skills I had built, not for the purpose of protecting myself, just because I had committed to doing the work well, turned out to be exactly the tools I needed when the ground shifted under me. I did not plan that. But I had prepared for it anyway, without knowing it. That is what I would tell anyone who is sitting where I was sitting: not to be fearless. Not to trust that things will work out, but to do the work in front of you completely and carefully, even when no one is watching. Even when you are not sure it matters, because the record you build in ordinary time is the only thing you have when the extraordinary moment arrives. Brenda asked me once, after everything had settled, whether I felt like I had won. I thought about it for a while before I answered her. The accounts were frozen. The company was gone. The marriage was over. Donovan had made choices over a long period of time, quietly, and those choices had consequences that moved outward like water. They touched the business, the finances, the investigation, and eventually the federal record. Not because anyone punished him. Because the math was always there. The numbers were always true. You can hide things inside a ledger for a while, But ledgers are designed to balance, and they always do, eventually. I do not feel like I won. I feel like I finally understood what I had been building all along.